Dr. Olivia Moses, and welcome to Wellness Live, brought to you by Loma Linda University Health's Living Whole Wellness Program, just for you. Today we're going to be talking about relationships, and to be honest, let's be very honest here. Relationships are one of the most important things in life, and having healthy ones can actually be the difference between happiness and misery. So we have a very special guest where I'm very excited that he's here. His name is Randall Walker, and he is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Family Sciences, and he is the director of the Counseling and Family Sciences Clinic here at Loma Linda University. In my head, however, he's more famous for being one of my old teachers, so it's just a treat to have him here. And he's going to be talking to us about how to mend broken relationships, specifically how to heal important relationships and how to keep important relationships from breaking. So without further ado, here's Randall Walker.
Thank you, Olivia. So thank you for joining me this evening or this afternoon in talking about this really important topic. I was thinking as I was making this presentation that perhaps it would be the most helpful to talk about mending broken relationships kind of from the stance of how do you develop and maintain healthy relationships. And so that was where I'm going to start, and then toward the end I'll talk a little bit, or during the course of my talk I'll talk a little bit about how do you actually mend those relationships that are important to you that perhaps have broken. And I want to look at some questions to help orient us to our talk this evening. When you think about positive relationships, what images come to mind? You might almost take a minute and kind of reflect about who have been those relationships, or what have been those important relationships that have informed you about what is a relationship or what is a healthy relationship. And then once you maybe get a picture in your mind about what those relationships might look like, I would ask you to consider who are the role models for good relationships in your life. It might be a parent, it might be a friend, it might be somebody at work, it might be somebody in the community. They might be famous, or they might be unknown to most of us. But all of us probably have watched over the course of our lifetimes people who have informed us about what constitutes a good relationship. And then once you get that kind of in mind, I'd ask you to think about why relationships. You know, what purpose do relationships serve? Like Olivia just mentioned a moment ago, relationships are a very important part of our life. And I think they do serve a purpose, and I'll kind of talk about that toward the end of my presentation. All of this, though, and the reason for talking about this, all of this goes into a theory about relationships. We're in an academic setting, after all, and so we have to have theories, right? So what is our theory? What's your theory about relationships and healthy relationships or satisfying relationships? And all of these things go into that mix about how we consider relationships. So once we've got some of these questions in mind, I want to maybe then draw our attention to the changing nature of modern relationships. Probably it's no news to you that relationships are changing, and that the relationships today that probably many of us are familiar with don't probably look a lot like what perhaps we grew up with, or what we were exposed to, or maybe what we learned when we were younger. But lots of things are changing, and there's lots of influences that go into those changes. For instance, our context, and our context can be a whole bunch of different things. But for instance, our culture, or our economic status, gender, religious identities or religious traditions, and other social forces all go into shaping and influencing how we think about relationships, how we experience our relationships, and how we live out relationships. Using just like a marital relationship for a moment as an example, I think back about just a relatively short time ago in human history, 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century. You know, the average life expectancy at that time was, from what I understand, somewhere under 60 years of age. Well, if people at that time married and they knew either consciously or unconsciously that their relationship would maybe last 20 or 30 years, that probably influenced how they lived out those relationships, versus for many of us today, where perhaps we'll live to be 80, 90, or 100 years old. If I know that the person that I'm going to go into this committed relationship with, I'm going to be with for the next 60, 70, 80 years, wow, that's a much different kind of relationship than maybe my grandparents or great-grandparents chose. And so those kinds of influences shape this changing nature of relationship. And then all of this goes into forming our expectations and assumptions about relationship, which have a big impact on how we experience how we experience our relationships. If I have realistic expectations or unrealistic expectations, it definitely plays out in how I experience my relationships. Another important factor that shapes my experience probably are some misconceptions that I have. And unfortunately, if you pay any attention to media, there's lots of current misconceptions about relationship. As a marriage and family therapist, I get people who come into my office frequently and are talking about these misconceptions. And one common misconception I think many people maybe hold is that relationships don't change. So, maybe somebody starts a relationship, they get married, or a parent has a child, and kind of the expectation is that that relationship is going to remain relatively stable over the course of their lifetime or over the course of the relationship. That isn't necessarily so, and so relationships change over time and consequently adapt sometimes. It would be nice maybe if they don't change, but it's probably not really realistic. Another very common misconception is that relationships are conflict-free. And especially for some of us who are coming out of religious traditions, there may be values that say that conflict is bad, or belief systems that say conflict is bad. And so then what do we do when we do experience conflicts in our relationships? Well, there's research that shows that you don't have to have necessarily a conflict-free relationship in order to have a satisfying relationship. And we'll talk about what do you do with conflict in a minute. Another common misconception is that relationships can't survive significant stresses like death or infidelity. And there are people that find their way to get through those significant life changes and are able to somehow repair their relationship. And we'll talk in a minute about repairs and how you do that. There may be the idea that a healthy relationship has, there's some standard that all relationships can be judged by. I don't know that that's necessarily true. And then finally, there may be this belief that some relationships, especially marriage, should be held on to forever, or that we should never let go of relationships. Again, that would be nice if that were the truth, but the reality is sometimes, for whatever reason, there are relationships that may hurt people or be harmful to people. And at those times, it may be necessary to make the difficult choice to move on, or for safety's sake, to get out of those kinds of relationships. There's lots of other common misconceptions that probably impact people, but all of those, again, go into maybe shaping how we experience relationships. But the one thing that I think relationships all kind of have in common, and I want to talk about that for the rest of the talk, something a little bit more positive, would be the notion of something called connection. And connection is something that all relationships, whether they're work relationships, intimate relationships, family relationships, all share in common. And that connection, that ability for us to connect to the people that we're in relationship with, is an essential part of relationships. And I want to focus the rest of the talk on talking about how do you build and maintain that connection.
Well, thank you, Randall. That was excellent of going over the misconceptions. So our first question actually is about misconceptions.
Okay.
It is, what misconceptions have you seen most often destroy marital relationships?
I think that's an interesting question. I think the question I think the way that I would see it is probably the big one is this idea that that there's no conflicts in relationship. And so for some of us, maybe, again, like I said, who have maybe a value system that says conflicts are bad, or we've grown up in a household where maybe people didn't know what to do with conflicts, then we start experiencing conflicts. And then what do you do with these conflicts? Conflict doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is over, or it necessarily destroys the relationship. You can live with conflicts, and if you're close to people, you're going to have conflicts, and so they can actually, believe it or not, bring people closer together.
That's a nice paradigm shift for a lot of people, I'm sure, to hear that. Another question we have are, what signs are irreparable? What are signs of an irreparable relationship?
You mean a relationship that's kind of done?
Right.
Yeah, and just cut to the chase, it's done. All right. Interestingly, there is a resource that I'm going to share with you at the end of the talk, a researcher named John Gottman up at the University of Washington in Seattle, who has done lots of research. And Gottman actually describes some characteristics about a relationship that he says are predictive that the relationship is on the verge of its end. And oddly enough, they're not usually really big, kind of dramatic things. One of the things that I can only remember right now while I'm standing here talking to you is contempt. When there is a lot of contempt in a relationship, that oddly enough, that usually spells the demise of the relationship or can signal the demise of the relationship. So it's not necessarily something really big and dramatic. It could be something kind of subtle, but it has a way of destroying a relationship.
Our next question is, does it make sense to work on weaknesses in the relationship or to focus on strengths in the relationship?
That's an extremely interesting question. You know, common sense would say if you focus on weaknesses, that maybe you could convert those weaknesses into strengths. However, there's been a lot of research over the past probably 20 years that looks at what they call strengths-based approaches in psychotherapy, marriage and family therapy, psychology. And I would think if you can find what works and do more of that typically that may work better than trying to improve strengths or trying to improve weaknesses or the deficits in a marital relationship or any kind of relationship for that matter.
When you're looking at these misconceptions in a relationship, how does someone get over those misconceptions? Because, you know, you talked about culture and family, and that is deep rooted, you know, so how does someone go about actually getting over these things to look at the relationship anew?
That's also a really good question. One of the things I think one would need to do is to educate themselves. I think one of the things that in society that we haven't done a very good job doing is educating people about how to have healthy relationships and actually invest energy into healthy relationships. You know, we're just now probably starting to develop means of teaching people how to be parents. I think for a long time there's been this kind of assumption, I mean, maybe that's not totally accurate, but we've had this assumption that parenting should come automatically and it's not an acquired skill. I think relationships are an acquired skill. And there's an element of relationships that's automatic, but I think there's a lot of the automatic quality of relationships that isn't necessarily what probably we as people would want to continue. And I think the hope for a future probably rests in us developing intentional strategies around developing these kinds of relationships we really want to see, not only intimate relationships, but community relationships and larger global relationships.
Okay, thank you. So keep those questions coming. Go ahead and type in your questions, and I will be back in 10 minutes and ask your questions.
Okay. All right. So then, these are amazing questions. Let's move on and kind of then talk about how do you build this connection. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, the connections, we have automatic connections. And one of the big automatic connections that we get is at birth, we automatically connect with our mothers. We are hardwired to biologically, psychologically, emotionally, neurologically connect shortly after birth. And that connection becomes the template, the foundation for all the relationships in the rest of our lives. That automatic kind of natural connection that occurs in the beginning isn't necessarily something that, it doesn't come as easily for the rest of our lives. And so we have to do some things that are kind of maybe more intentional. And so we want to look at building some of those connections might require us to watch our expectations and assumptions about relationships. Again, as I said earlier, if we have healthy assumptions and expectations, probably we get a more balanced view of relationship, versus if I have unrealistic expectations, then maybe that's going to pose lots of challenges and distract me from doing what I want to do. Another piece would be to create an environment that's safe for feelings. There's a lot of research and lots of talk going on today in the psychotherapy field about the importance of emotions. Maybe you've heard things about emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Well, creating an atmosphere in a relationship, whether it's a work relationship or an intimate relationship, that allows for an expression of feelings, an open expression of feelings, is important. A place where we can accept and respect one another's feelings, no matter whether those feelings are comfortable for us to hear or uncomfortable for us to hear. And an opportunity to recognize and validate one another's feelings. This is easier said than done, because if somebody's angry at me and they have strong emotions about something that I've done or something they perceive that I've done, it's difficult sometimes to be able to listen respectfully to their emotions. But creating that safe environment where feelings can help us naturally connect is part of how we build and maintain that connection that we want, that we intentionally want. Another piece would be that we need to be flexible and open to how the relationship is changing and evolving over time, and be willing to adapt to those changes. I was thinking earlier today that, my mother is still alive. My mother is going to be 97 years old in a couple of weeks. And the relationship that I have with my 97-year-old mother today is much different than the relationship I had with her when I was 5. Hopefully, we've adapted our relationship and we treat one another differently today than we did when I was 5 and she was much younger, right? So there's got to be that ability to adapt and flex with the changes that life inevitably brings. There's also the willingness or the need to accept conflict in our lives. If I'm close to somebody and I feel passionately about maybe my point of view and the other person feels the same way, there's going to be conflict. Conflict doesn't necessarily need to destroy a relationship. It can actually bring people closer together. And for some of us, again, that maybe have grown up in families or situations where conflict was seen as bad, that may be kind of a paradigm shift, like Olivia was saying a minute ago. But that's a really important piece, that conflict doesn't necessarily have to destroy a relationship. And then finally, we need to learn how to repair, reconcile, and reconnect with one another. This is that healing or mending piece that that was talked about in the title, or implied in the title. Now, the repair piece actually comes out of John Gottman's research. And he talks about the idea that it may not necessarily be so important that we never have ruptures in a relationship. So, we've got this connection and at some point the connection breaks, let's say, or there's some distance or a disconnect that occurs. Well, that's going to happen sometimes, even in the best relationships. And when that disconnect or that disruption occurs, how do I repair that? How do I reconnect with that person that I'm close to, or that I want to be close to, or that I want to have a connection with? And he talks about something called repair attempts. And that may be something as simple as a bid to move closer to the person to reconnect. It might be, asking them a question. It might be drawing their attention to something. It might be coming into their presence when part of me says, I don't want to be in their presence. I want to avoid this person. And there's the option that the other person could always reject that repair attempt. That's part of how the process works sometimes. So we have to allow that to maybe happen. But being willing to repair the relationship once it's been broken is an essential part of building that connection and maintaining that connection. There's the other piece about then reconciling. And I think when I prepared the talk, I looked up in the dictionary and I believe that the word reconcile actually talks about healing a break. Well, what does it take to heal a break? My area of specialty is addictions. And in addictions, there's this idea about how. How do you recover from addictions? Well, there's this idea about honesty. So if I'm honest with the person that I'm in relationship with about how this disruption or this break has occurred or this conflict has occurred, that can definitely help reconcile this break. If I'm open to hearing their feelings and their point of view and their experience, which again may be difficult sometimes and it may be painful, that's an important part of the process. And then, am I willing to admit my mistakes? I had a colleague years ago who talked about giving myself the gift of being willing to be wrong, giving up on being right. And that, for some of us coming out of certain contexts, that may be a difficult thing to do, but that may be an essential piece of what it takes to repair that break and to reconcile with somebody we're close to. And then time always plays a role in all of this. There's that old adage about time heals all wounds, and I don't know about that. I don't know how true that is. But I do know that sometimes when there's been some sort of significant break, there can be a lot of energy, and it may take time for that energy to kind of cool down. And so there's a time element there. But there's also the time element of when a break has occurred, we don't necessarily, or it may be inadvisable, to wait a long time to try to repair that break. And so the sooner that maybe an approach can be made or a repair attempt can be made, probably the better. because then it doesn't allow maybe that to become kind of an entrenched pattern. And then reconnecting. How do we reconnect? And I think for me, one of the things that I've found helpful, and again, I think in this context it may be especially meaningful, is that thinking about a big picture and being courageous to make a move forward, keeping in mind what is that big picture that kind of orients me to why relationships are important. And it goes back to that initial question about, so what's the purpose of relationships? Why do we have relationships? And so I want to challenge you, what's your understanding of the big picture in terms of relationships? I know that or at least I'm pretty confident that when I work out the different relationships that I have, marital relationships, family relationships, work relationships, and sometimes they're not very easy, sometimes they're very difficult, sometimes they're very challenging. I think to myself, why am I doing this? Why am I working through these sorts of things? And I think about that big picture. I think for those of us that are committed to working on our relationships and trying to build and maintain those connections, that in a way we're contributing to our larger society and contributing to more peaceful relationships and more human connections. With some of the tragedies that we've seen recently in the news, I wonder sometimes, can people hurt people that they're connected to? And it would seem like one of the things that happens in common sometimes in those situations is there's a disconnection. And the perpetrator sometimes is cut off or feels cut off from the larger society. So I think working maybe with our small relationships and then expanding out into those larger relationships can be a way to actually do something very meaningful for society. Now there's resources, of course, right? And here I just put up on the screen some resources that I found helpful. There's the work of John Gottman. He's written quite a few books over the years about marital relationships, and in the past probably 10, 15 years, he's written about how to raise emotionally intelligent children, and that's a book I can't recommend highly enough. It's a very accessible book. Another person is Sue Johnson, who's also a psychologist who's developed a model of couples therapy that's very effective. Gottman even recognizes her. And she's written a book called Hold Me Tight, which if you're in a marital relationship or committed relationship, I can highly recommend that to you. And then there's Daniel Siegel, who's a psychiatrist over at UCLA, and he's written a lot about brain development and something he calls interpersonal neurobiology. And I would draw your attention to his books. He's written some amazing books on parenting. And one of the books, The Whole Brain Child, talks about the role of relationships and as a parent understanding the connection between relationships and what a child is trying to communicate. Sometimes you might need professional help. And I would draw your attention to then the Behavioral Health Institute, where I work with a whole bunch of other mental health professionals or behavioral health professionals. If you needed some professional support, we've got students, licensed people, all sorts of people who would be dying to talk to you to help support you to develop those relationships that you would hope you would have.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for those resources. That's really helpful, Randall. We have a bunch of questions,
okay.
So let's get to it.
All right.
The first one's a really good one.
Okay.
Are there good techniques to improve or salvage a broken business or work relationship?
Wow. That is a hard question. And because sometimes I think people think that the broken business relationships, maybe there's a kind of a different standard, and sometimes we don't. We don't necessarily have the intimate relationships at work or business that we would maybe have, obviously, in our personal lives. I think the same idea, though, about a bid for connection would still apply, and you would just need to think about, well, what would be appropriate within the context? And it might mean, making that step forward, trying to connect somehow in a meaningful way, in an appropriate way that would fit in your setting. That might be one suggestion that I would make. And here on campus, of course, you've had Shelby Romer come and talk. So the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, might be a resource in a case like that to kind of help brainstorm some things. Or again, the Behavioral Health Institute might be a resource. Okay,
great. Another question we have is, do different personality types need more emphasis with certain reconciliation techniques?
That's oh, you're keeping me on my toes. It could be. I think, relationships are all different. There's different styles of relationship. I think definitely some of us approach relationships very differently. I'm an introvert. I married, of course, an extrovert. And so we have very different ways of maybe reconciling. And I think over the course of my relationship, I think I've learned how to maybe come out a little bit more, to reconcile perhaps with my more extroverted partner. And I think she's learned how to maybe give me some of that space when I want to be alone. But again, for me, because I could be alone for the rest of my life, all right? But so what I've learned to do is, though, that bigger picture informs me, so I don't want to be alone the rest of my life. So for me, sometimes it's coming out of that comfort zone and initiating contact when my personality would say, I'd rather hide back here for the rest of my life. I could have been a monk. I could have been a hermit. Who are we kidding? All right. But that's not exactly what I'm cut out for this time around.
So another question we have, are there constructive ways to make fights overtly beneficial to the relationship? To be honest, I'm going to plead, I don't know the answer to that. I know in the past there was a lot written about fair fighting, and there was this idea about constructive arguing, and I'm less familiar with that because I believe that's kind of fallen out of fashion. However, I do know that my experience clinically has been that when people begin to fight so much that it's damaging the relationship, and usually that's where it could be more abusive, or there's some really difficult things that are said that are hard to take back. It would seem like once a relationship gets to that point, it's really hard. Probably, it's not impossible, but it becomes more difficult to repair that sort of damage. And so my advice would be just don't go there. But that sometimes takes more discipline than maybe some of us have. Here's another good question. What are the essential elements to a successful relationship?
I think in some way, I would go back to some of the slides and talk about that. I think part of it is respect. I think part of it is openness. I think part of it is willingness to, respect one another's feelings. Feelings, I think, can't be emphasized enough. Feelings give meaning in relationships. That's, I think, one of the functions emotions serve. And feelings also connect us. And so I think being comfortable with feelings, which is a challenge for some of us, is probably something that if somebody really wanted to improve or increase the likelihood of success in their relationship, I think becoming more comfortable with feelings could be really important. There's a big gender piece in that, because in the dominant culture here in the United States, men usually are not very well socialized to handle feelings. And so for us men, it may be learning how to get more comfortable with feelings. And I think for women, it may be, in a traditional marriage or a traditional relationship, it may be learning how to be more comfortable with, maybe giving the man a little bit of a break. I don't know if that's inappropriate to say, but that's what I would say to a couple if they came to my practice.
Okay, so let's squeeze in one more really quick, and I know this is going to be hard to answer really quick, so this is a challenge.
Thanks, Olivia.
What is important to know about fighting/arguing with my spouse in front of the children?
That's a really good question. Okay. So I think I can answer that pretty simply. I think for some of us, some parents I think make the mistake that they think they should never fight in front of the kids. But remember, how do I learn to be in a marital relationship? I learn by seeing what my parents are doing. So if my parents take their fights elsewhere and I never get to see my parents fight, then what am I going to do when I get married and my partner wants to fight with me? I don't have any role model. So I'm not saying if people are becoming very aggressive or violent or some of those sorts of things, that's not what I'm talking about. But I think, again, children learn and know how to be in relationship by what they're seeing their parents model. So that would be what I would say.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully that enlightened everyone out there as it did me, and it was just a treat to have you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for all your questions. And I want to remind you that on August 31st at 5:30 right here, we are going to have another Wellness Live session with Preston Brown. He is our Fire and Life Safety Coordinator who's going to talk to us about fires. And if any of you have seen the devastation that fires can bring, it makes so much sense that we look at our homes and actually see what we can do to prevent these fires. Again, thank you so much for your questions. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and this has been Wellness Live.